Okay, so uh, I think there's always a risk of there just being really like high level words that are used when we're talking about um climate finance, the high level negotiations, the COP. So just want to give you a quick like jargon buster, and if there are any other words or phrases that come up that you're not sure about, put them into the chat box and we'll aim to answer them. Maybe we'll have the knowledge, maybe the group will have the knowledge too. So I'm sure that all together we'll figure it out and come to a good understanding of the different phrases and different words that come up. There's a lot of like acronyms, so I'm going to ask Molly and Anya just to try when there are like acronyms, try and explain rather than just the letters, because that's where we get lost very easily. So two of the main words that you're going to hear around climate finance are mitigation and adaptation. So, mitigation is the action of reducing the seriousness, the severity, or the painfulness of something. So, basically, we're trying to make the outcome like less bad. We try and change different ways to make a further outcome not as bad as it could be. Adaptation is when we have to respond or react to a current situation. So, taking action to prepare for and adjust to a current and projected impact of climate change. So, let's take the instance of flooding. Adaptation is where in flooding would be that you're going to build or build different measures in to be able to protect a certain area because we know that there's going to be overflow of this flooding happen. Maybe that's due to dams putting in or the change of a riverbed that then has caused flooding. An adaptation would be then to put in like flood defenses. Mitigation could actually be that you go back further up the line and remove those dams then so that that flooding isn't a kind of a problem that happens later on. So there's a few ways of looking at actual mitigation adaptation in this context through, let's say, like finance or through actual like infrastructure and agreements. So they can either be physical mitigations or adaptations or legal or monetary. Yeah, if you've got like the little magnifying glass emoji, you can put that into the chat box if you have any questions to a specific word, or you could just raise your hand or pop it into the box, whichever. Great. Also, developed versus developing countries. So describing a country as developed or developing can erase the diversity of a country, and it can give an unfair and often more westernized view of a nation and state and its people. So it's better to refer to a country as maybe their economy, their developing economy or not. But this is still problematic. So, in terms of saying low income countries, middle income countries, or high income countries, might actually be more representative of the financial status of a country rather than is a country developed or developing, because culture, people that are living there, they're absolutely developed. They're not developing people. It takes more of like a person-centric approach. But I'll put it back to you. Why might you think that just referring to the economy is also the economy of a nation or a state could be problematic? What issues might we come up against? Any thoughts on that one yet, Molly?
It's like judging one country by our standards. So there's different nations and peoples who would have different priorities outside of a capitalistic economy, through like cultural practices, and but also not taking into account how through colonization, all that historical aspect, how certain countries ended up being more developed, and seeing other countries as trying to catch up to developing countries is quite narrow-minded and kind of ignores the more historical aspect of how things got to where they are, and also the priorities of the different cultures within a country.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you. And also, like I said, like the historical context of also why we are in the kind of the current state of the climate state that we're in. And Rory's saying, yeah, happiness and other metrics aren't taken into account. And yeah, Bhutan is also an excellent example of this. I won't put words in your mouth, Rory, but if you could on kind of unmute, what is it about Bhutan that people generally know or think about in terms of like, I'm going to use the air quotes, developed or developing?
I'm not 100% sure on the name of the man whose TED Talk I watched, but he was a former minister or someone from Bhutan, and they're obviously, by all metrics, Western metrics, GDP, anything. Bhutan is not a first world developed, or whatever you want those terms you want to use, nation, but they have some of the highest coverage of forest of any country in the world. They have a great green agenda. I think they have a net negative carbon emission. So yeah, for all those reasons, basically, and I don't think their government has any ambition to change that. And they're very tough on tourism in terms of making sure that doesn't affect their effect on the planet either.
Yeah, their ecology and kind of the maintaining and the protection of the areas too. Thank you for that example. That's really excellent. Great. Okay, so I just kind of mentioned this already, didn't I? That adaptation can range from building flood defenses, setting up early warning systems for cyclones, switching to drought-resistant crops, and to redesigning communication systems, business operations, and government policies. Our view, when we're talking from like Friends of the Earth, our view on climate finance takes a climate justice perspective. So we acknowledge that those that have contributed to the problem should take greater responsibility for also solving it. So that takes in historical context. The IPCC report on climate change also names colonization as a serious driver of greenhouse gas emissions and global warming and climate change. So there are like different stages and types of responsibility that comes into account when we're looking at why we are where we are. And it also should take into account who is profiting and benefiting most from fossil fuel industries. So we know that climate action requires significant investment, and its value is immense: a livable planet, a livable climate. Countries around the world are showing how climate finance can improve people's lives and prospects for the planet too. Does that all sound okay? I don't see the chat's not happened, so it must be. Okay, great. So I'm going to pass on over to Anya now.
Hello, everyone. And just as Sarah said, if you have any questions, please do pop them in the chat box, and I'll do my best to kind of address your questions. I know we were hoping to hear a bit about COP, so we're going to open with that. So COP stands for Conference of the Parties, and you can have a COP of various different treaty or convention bodies, but largely the largest is the COP retaining to the Climate Convention. So COP itself is the supreme decision-making body of the United Nations Convention on Climate Change. And all states that are parties to the convention are then represented at COP. Here they kind of review the progress of the processes of the UN framework on climate change, such as, legally binding agreements, documents, and various statements that have come out of previous COPs, and reflect on the progress of the commitments that have been made thus far. And then that can be used to make decisions and take action on different ways of implementing the convention. So this can include how an institution on an international and a national level ensure that the agreements are implemented on a national and regional level as well. And you'll find a key task at COP is to review the reports submitted that are often referred to as NDCs, or nationally determined contributions, which takes into account the greenhouse gas emission reduction targets and how the progress has been on climate action. So if we head over to the next slide there, Sarah, please. So what we're here today to talk about is climate finance. And the difficulty with climate finance, as you may find, is there's no one universally accepted definition. The Standing Committee on Finance, which is created under the convention, they review different things when it comes to how climate finance will be operationalized and review its effectiveness. In their biannual assessment, this is the definition they came up with. So climate finance aims at reducing emissions, being the mitigation section, enhancing sinks of greenhouse gases, and aims at reducing vulnerability of and maintaining and increasing the resilience of human and ecological systems to negative climate change impacts. So we'll see in that definition elements of mitigation and adaptation popping out there. But in more simpler terms, climate finance is intended to aid reducing emissions and enhancing resilience to climate change going forward. So we head to the next slide there, please. So why is climate finance so important? Why are we talking about this? Why are we here at all? So within the United Nations framework, climate justice has been put forward, also taking into account climate finance. So historically, climate finance has fallen short of what's needed, and the gap, therefore, is going to widen as extreme weather events become more frequent and severe. And most recent estimations are finding that about $6 trillion are going to be needed to implement climate action plans just in low-income countries by 2030. And then analysis on finance suggests that we must be increasing our financial commitments by at least 5 times each year. And we are sitting in the middle of a bit of a balancing act, because if we fail to make investments in mitigation, the cost of adaptation will continue to grow and it expands and accelerates. So it's all about trying to keep a bit of a balance going in turbulent political times as well. So if we head to the next slide. Thank you. So I suppose to answer one question that has been brought up earlier, under the Paris Agreement, which is the most recent treaty to come out of the UNFCCC, the people or the countries or the entities that provide the finance are developed countries. And you'll find throughout here that I'll be using the terms developed and developing countries. And that's not ideal, but it's how it's laid out within the treaty bodies. You'll also often hear them being referred to Annex 1 countries being developing countries and Annex 2 countries being developed countries. And that's how we divide our responsibilities under the UN framework of climate change. So the developed countries voluntarily and are encouraged to, on a voluntary basis, provide this finance after goals are set at various COPs. And how much that is, at the moment, there's a goal of $100 billion annually through to 2025. And now when we're heading into this COP, we'll see a new goal being implemented. Can you see the slides there? Are you able to see the slides on your wall? Can everyone else see the slides?
Yeah, now it is visible. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. And on that, we can move to the next slide after a brief feature of Bernie Sanders there. Perfect. And again, another question I think was brought up earlier is what exactly does this money go to? What exactly are we promising to fund? So one of the largest kind of expenses that come out of the framework is funding developing countries and their own reports on climate, which can be very costly and involve bringing in a lot of technical expertise. So that's one of the larger things that are funded, but also see adaptation measures, mitigation measures, and also climate education and public awareness, and also tech development and transfer, which is going to be one of the larger topics that's going to come up in this COP as well when it comes to, for example, early warning systems for different natural disasters. And you'll also see it through forestry and reforesting projects that are applied through the adaptation kind of area of the adaptation fund. So coming off of, that and see all these priorities that are being funded, what exactly are you guys seeing as the kind of the top priorities in your opinion as to where the finance should go? Why do you think that it should be that way? And how might this change based off of where you're living, or taking into account maybe perhaps people in different countries and different areas, and how do you think those priorities balance up and kind of in those contexts? So be interested to hear from you guys on that.
I think I've studied a bit of this university. At least now that we're this far down the road, both mitigation and adaptation are basically equally important. And I think that depends a lot on where you live in the world. But you know, really looking at it, those people who are going to be hardest hit, adaptation is going to be should be the main focus. Whereas again, mitigation will likely be in the hands of those who are actually causing problems to begin with. So.
All right, it was a little bit hard to hear you. It might be connection, or it might just be you're further away from the mic. I got parts of what you're saying. I think it depends on where you are, where you're living. The priorities will be different based on what your experience is. But if you could just repeat a little bit again of if it works, let's see.
Hopefully it's maybe.
Oh yeah, that's better. Yeah.
No, my Bluetooth headset is not great. Uh, yeah, basically just historical CO2 emissions have been largely contributed by the likes of the USA, the United Kingdom, and they're also mostly like the population centers of a lot of both of those countries and more countries that have contributed so much are not going to be the ones most affected by climate change, at least to begin with. So adaptation will not be as important. It still will be important for them, of course. But, the likes of, Bangladesh, the huge population centers like Jakarta, Manila, they will be hit really, really hard within the next 2 decades. And adaptation in those places will be priority one. So it's hugely dependent on geography and yeah.
Yeah, so adaptation is more like when the issue is at your door, how do you respond to it? And mitigation is how do we reduce the severity of what's coming down the line? Thank you. Patty, you had some thoughts.
Hello. Yeah.
Hi.
So I think climate education and awareness is one of the things that should be given most importance, according to me. Because when we are looking at mitigation, adaptation, or anything, it all starts when it is there in your head that yes, these things needs to be done. These things need to be there for us to adapt to any kind of situations. So definitely there are many things being done. Awareness is there. Most of the people are knowing. But when we look at the developing countries, or when we look at the local level, I think awareness is still lacking because we still see many of the countries which are still depending on the firewoods for preparing a single meal, right? Or when we look at making constructions specifically. So back from the place where I am, there are few NGOs who are working on utilizing resources, the natural resources which are, or rather than natural resources, I would say the local resources which are available for building up the houses. But still, when we look at the majority, it is more about the transportation of the concrete or bricks, which is definitely not environmental friendly. And we are talking of the people, including I, who are aware of the climate things, but still we are not taking action on those. So I think those things are important. If every day we are hearing about that, I know means I was knowing back 2 years, 3 years also that climate change is happening. It is an important issue, but now since I'm hearing it on everyday basis, everywhere going on around me, I think I'm more concerned, more aware when it is coming to me back and again now.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing I would like to ask here that, like Molly said, that a significant amount of fund has been allocated to the finance reporting, right? Climate reports and all that. So I'm not able to understand that how that significant amount is being allocated to formation of reports and what role it is playing in all this. Yeah.
Good question.
Yeah.
Will we just hold on to that for a second, Anya, and see if there's any other questions, and maybe we can answer them together. Or yeah, what about priorities for everybody else? So we had education's a higher priority, making people aware, being able to support communities to take more environmentally, more green. I'm saying these all with like kind of quotation marks as well. Be able to make different choices, but we also have to recognize that communities might necessarily have the access to the non like dirty energy. So how do we then support communities and being able to do so through climate finance? Okay. Do you want to answer the question, Anya?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
So, oops, sorry, we have someone in the waiting room there. So when we're talking about the reports on climate, so within the UNFCCC, the Convention Framework Agreements, each country has agreed to be bringing reports to the UN for every COP, and that will essentially account for progress on climate action for developing countries. Would also include requests for different kind of support. They'll bring in analyses for different kinds of support. What a lot of what that funding will go to is funding people to spend the time to put together these quite complex and comprehensive supports, and also the training of local people to be able to do this effectively in a way that benefits their country as well. So that costs quite a lot. It costs quite a lot of money, more than one would think, because so many hours and also such technical expertise that is built up over time. And that would be quite common across different conventions, even Convention of the Rights of the Child as a further example. Various technical reports, reviews, interviews that go on, and public consultations can also feed into those as well. So I hope that answered your question as to why it costs so much. And yes, the UNFCCC does aim to support developing countries in making those reports.
Part of reporting is really, the evaluation and accountability side of things too. So not having a baseline, not knowing where your start point is or where you're aiming to go or how far you have to go to get there, requires a lot of different types of measurements that even in Ireland haven't been measured in the ways that you kind of would expect. So a good example would be the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. Each country is requested that they are, measuring against all these, I think it's like 196 indicators and then over 200 different, 196 targets and over 200 indicators. And they all vary country to country depending on your level of like economic development. So countries are going to have to do a lot of sort of like introspection, look inwards and see different levels of where they need to then invest more money into. Because we can't just, this is a part of the negotiations as well, is like the building up of trust to be able to spend and funnel money into these different areas of work. There needs to be a level of accountability within that too. Okay. Any other thoughts about maybe what you would see as a kind of a main priority around the types of how the finance might be spent? No? Okay, great. So I'm going to go back to sharing.
Perfect. So I hope that gave you guys a decent introduction into the different themes that we're looking at regarding climate finance. So now to move on to the beast of it all, that's COP29, which Sarah, Molly, and I will be braving next week. So COP29 is happening in Baku in Azerbaijan. And it's been called dubbed the Climate Finance COP. And that's because, as per agreed in the Paris Agreement, that a new goal for how much finance we're going to be collecting going forward will begin in 2025. So as I mentioned before, there's a kind of floor of 100 billion US dollars, which is hugely like inadequate considering that the adaptation and mitigation estimates are in the trillions. So if you take that into account, and also take into account that we're quite behind in raising that goal itself, it's quite a big ask that's being put forward at this COP. So we're calling this goal the new collective. So it's collective for all the countries within the framework. Quantified meaning just the amount of the quantified goal, just mean the amount of money, and on climate finance, and that's essentially just where that money is going to be allocated to. And that goal will account for a floor of 100 billion US dollars and aims to increase year on year. We go to the next slide, please. So from a more civil society perspective, there's been calls to double adaptation finance from 2025. And the needs of the global south are in the 130, 140, 415 billion annually till 2030, and then it rises again to the trillions through an estimate from the UN Environment Programme. And from our perspective, we're really pushing to amplify the voices of our friends and colleagues in the most affected peoples and areas of vulnerable countries, whichever phrase we'd like to use, for the loss and damage to be a focus. Pledges for the Loss and Damage Fund that was operationalized last year at COP28 has been about a 700 million, give or take, and that's less than 0.2% of what will be needed going forward. So we're at the bottom of quite a steep climb, but we are really trying to keep that equity and that climate justice point going. So what I think is important for us as activists in civil society and people to understand is the different sides of the debate and why exactly this is going to be such a difficult diplomatic feat to reach at this COP. So I put together a little explainer on the kind of two sides, again, referring to the developing sides of the conversation. So what the disagreements tend to be about is the overall scale, so how much, who exactly should be contributing to this fund, and who should be in receipt of the money and for what purpose. So far, the consensus is that it needs to be much higher, above 100 billion annually, and we'll need to increase and increase and increase as time goes on. You see here it says Bonn SB 60, which is a kind of a pre-COP meeting that happened in Bonn in March, I believe. You can correct me if I'm wrong on that. And within that, the Global South negotiating groups, as they've joined together to bring their voices together, has been put forward at 1.1 trillion and 1.3 trillion per year. And so far, the global north or developed countries haven't put forward any sort of number as of yet, but we might get to one in the next couple of days coming up to the negotiations. So I think I'll continue on to kind of talk about expanding the contributor base on the next slide. So the two sides of the coins is that developed countries are concerned about their own financial difficulties and other responsibilities that come from the public purse. And as we've seen, it is a very steep ask. And considering widening the contributor base, the Paris Agreement and the different UNFCCC things that have been deciding on who is contributing to climate finance thus far is back in 30 odd years ago, and hasn't evolved over time, taking into account the growth of different economies. So there is an argument that countries such as China or countries in the Gulf that produce a lot of fossil fuels and have had a lot of economic growth since Paris should be contributing also to the pot. In Canada and Switzerland actually have proposed criteria such as per capita income to decide whether countries should be brought into the pool as well. Another suggestion was, accumulated emissions per person in a country. And these kind of different metrics that would be used now would bring into maybe Russia, Saudi Arabia, and maybe China in some estimates. And then there's the complete other side of the coin where developing countries are seeing this as trying to undermine this core principle of equity and justice that has been followed through within the UNFCCC of what's called the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities, which is a big jargon way of saying that we as different countries have different responsibility for historical emissions and have benefited from development in such a way. And it's bringing that equity into perspective of understanding we all have a common goal of mitigation, but also that we all have different capabilities of how we can contribute to that. So again, it's taking into account this historical historical issue, but also the need for equity and a polluter pays kind of understanding through that. So if we move on maybe to the next slide, what is new with this COP is that developed countries are arguing for different forms of finance aside from public finance, so taxpayer money essentially, to be taken into account into that pot. So developed countries are arguing for narrowly targeting that public finance to support countries that are the most vulnerable, such as the least developed countries or the small island developing states, which are again more acronyms, but essentially they're trying to narrow who exactly can receive funding that comes from the public purse. And also bringing in conflict affected states, which is another, step forward in kind of how we understand vulnerable countries within the climate context. And again, there's suspicion about how this is being operationalized as, is it an attempt to divide, developing countries with the promise of prioritize support or a minimum allocation targets. So there is different ways of looking at that as well, and that kind of common theme then kind of comes across where the next slide when we're talking about where exactly the money should be coming from. So be through the next slide there, please, Sarah. Thank you. So again, developed countries are acknowledging that there does need to be a core public financial base, but how much that would be, and that's hugely up to debate at the moment. The US and other countries have also said that, that private finance sector investments, be it through investment funds or any other kind of private ways of raising money, should be also taken into account. I know when we were talking to Eamon Ryan today, he suggests he was talking about a billionaire's tax. See how that one goes for him. But again, developing countries have been putting forward a more concrete suggestions, such as the Arab states and African group suggesting, again, that 1.3 trillion US dollars goal going forward. So I just threw a lot at you, a lot of information, a lot of things going on, but hopefully you'll be able to get kind of a glimpse of where that debate is going. We have developed countries trying to find a way of raising the amount of finance that they can give, but also we have the developing countries and those who stand in solidarity with them, trying to push for that equitable nature of things going forward. And I found a very apt quote that kind of takes into account on the next slide. And it's from Leanne over in Germany, who's a very good colleague of ours as well. Says the inherent climate injustice is obvious. Developing countries are already paying with lost economic growth and development for climate impacts, which they have contributed significantly less than developed countries, which have profited from fossil fuel driven economic growth for up to a century longer. So that kind of brings us right back down to earth into the reality. And again, yes, I love that cat meme. It also takes into account very well. I did the math. We can't afford not to take climate action. So I think I'll hand you back to Sarah so I can stop bombarding you with information. If that's okay.
That's fantastic, Anya. Thank you so much. I've learned a lot about this too. And it's great to know going in, but I think what we should also be aware of is that yes, there's a lot of jargon, yes, there's a lot of terminology, but at the end of the day, that doesn't mean that any one of us isn't able to participate in these negotiations in some way, that we can push our representatives to take the stands that we want them to be brave and to be bold. They need to hear from us. I think that was quite transparent to us when we were meeting the minister. It's like, we want to keep on pushing on the climate justice piece. We want them to consider climate finance and all the sort of technicalities and bureaucratic stuff within that is actually what it ends up being about, is about people, about planet, your quality of life, able to live, feed your family, live a long and peaceful and safe life too, because obviously climate is so intersected with everything that we experience in our lives, including peace and justice. So before we go on to youth demands, our demand from COP, I'm going to stop sharing for a moment. We've got my colleague here. We are doing well for time. What's happening here? There we go. Yeah, we're doing well for time. So I wanted to check with you. We can either continue on and kind of finish up and around in about 20 minutes, or would you like to take like a 4 or 5 minute break? Oh, yeah. I think that's why, it's because we're speeding through it now. So yeah, what are your thoughts and questions at this point?
I mean, what are your thoughts? What, you know, you've raised so many perspectives, you know, US perspective, Swiss, you know, Canadian, Arab states, African states. What are you gonna bring? What's Friends of the Earth gonna, do you have a thought?
Rory, I couldn't even ask for a better segue than to hand over to my colleague Sean, who is going to talk about the Friends of the Earth demands that we have. And Sean will also be going to COP in the second half of the negotiations. So Molly, myself, and Anya are going to be there from the beginning, the 11th to the 17th. There's going to be the Global Day of Action on the 16th, and then Sean's arriving on the 17th. So hi Sean, welcome. You made it home.
Hello. Yeah, I made it home, just about. Yeah, great to see everyone, and yeah, really good to hear from everyone so far. I only just caught the last bit of that, but I really enjoyed hearing about all the different elements, and I learned some new things. As there's like so much to do with COP. There's so much detail in the climate finance and in the climate ambition. It's just there's so much of it that every time you hear someone talk about it, you just learn something new. So, I would just encourage everyone to I guess listen to it as much as they can, and it's really great that we're doing this tonight. Yeah, so I will go through some of Friends of the Earth's, I guess, key. Now, this is what I'm going to be working on when I'm over there. Now, unfortunately, I won't have a whole lot to say on climate finance, which will be the main topic of the COP. I can say a bit on it, but the reason I won't focus on it so much is because some of our other colleagues from the Stop Climate Chaos Coalition will also be at COP, and their basically their entire job revolves around advocating for climate finance, and they're much better at it than me. Oh, Rama? I see you have a hand
I
up there.
am so sorry, Sean. I did not want to cut you,
Yeah.
but the moment you started speaking, a question came to my mind.
Yeah, go for it.
Please pardon me for any noise that is coming.
No, you're good. You're good.
So actually, I have worked on UNFCCC projects back in India. Now I'm at Trinity studying development practice. So what I have observed is that we have, there were many climate adaptability projects being funded by UNFCCC in making the communities adapt, resilient to climate change. But the thing is, most of the funding gets spent on procurement of things enabling the communities to get there in terms of where the project guideline is saying it. So do you think, is there any framework or a success recipe that we can use in developing nations, because they are at the receiving end? Their development journey started and climate change is here, so they can't be the consumers. They have to now be mindful, thoughtful, conscious in how they consume whatever success or whatever development that is happening in low income countries. But I'm thinking, is there any way, because each chef is cooking their own recipe. So can we come up with frameworks which work? I know it's a very vague statement, but India is a big country. Africa is a big country. And there are many situations, climatic, financial, economic, political, demographic, which are similar. We can't write that off. But are there any successful stories in climate financing which we say, yes, it worked and it should be replicated, instead of coming up with various frameworks and formulas? I don't know if it is making sense, but this is something spoke to me, so I'm submitting here on the platform. I'm so sorry, Sean, that I your flow of thought.
No, you're okay. You're okay. Um, just does Sarah or Anya or Molly want to come in on that one?
Yeah, I think you kind of, the way that you frame the question actually gives you a little bit of the answer too. The fact that there's over 196 nations and states, and they're all at very different situations, culturally, historically, economically, the idea of there being a prescribed way of doing something would be going against a lot of, like, let's say, human rights and justice principles, because that takes away agency. However, that is where there's opportunities like these programs, like that you mentioned, that there should be like information shares and what works and what doesn't work. I would say, I would imagine a part of the evaluation process that Anya was talking about earlier is like, well, putting in the frameworks and the reporting aspect is to even measure what the successes are. Because sometimes from like a national perspective, you might see like, oh, okay, we've managed to reduce these level of emissions, or this number of people have been able to be taken out of poverty. But sometimes you lose a lot of the detail of like what was the actual like really low, like the local impact. I think best practice should be shared, and from like, say, in my experience, at least with Irish Aid, and through an educational perspective, and through, say, like in Europe and Erasmus, there are lots of opportunities for like skill shares or knowledge shares, or kind of like these, what were they called, like visits? I can't remember now, but like exchanges. But there's no like formal way of doing this. So with the Sustainable Development Goals, there are voluntary national reviews that have been like requested of states to be able to do. And those then allow people to see where projects are kind of flourishing and what's working and what doesn't work. I'm going to pass to Anya first, and I'll come back to you, Rama, if you had a comment on that, and then we'll go back to one.
I think
Sarah, thank you for.
yeah,
Uh,
definitely.
oh, I'm so sorry. Continue.
You're okay. Not to cut anyone off, I think Sarah hit the nail on the head, and I think maybe to further illustrate with an example of, one of the things that as, activists, we don't want to be pushing for too prescriptive. I know it's coming from someone who works in legal and governance is the day job, but keeping things too prescriptive when it comes to such a diverse way of the finance being applied would obviously be negative. But in terms of that agency and taking into account different aspects, but one that does come to mind is an adaptation project that was rolled out in a village in Nigeria that was focused towards the farmers in the area. And it was all about, the elders of the community doing like knowledge sharing. And, one example was brought up recently at an event I went to of them bringing up old folklore and how, certain trees are like special trees and you don't harm that tree, or you don't do certain things because it would make, maybe the fairies mad, or it would some sort of mystical figure, like bringing back that kind of like cultural element of how nature has been preserved by our elders for years and years, and that being kind of a focal point of communicating that to different communities in a way that they can resonate with as well. And that's something that, yeah, just came to mind with one of those projects. I think I'll bring it back to you, Sarah.
Let's go back to Rama. You wanted to say something.
Sarah, do you think carbon credits can play a role in incentivizing what good, uh, less developing countries are achieving in terms of building resilience, climate resilience, for them and for others? That's my last submission, because there are various programs happening in my country wherein we are sequestering carbon in soil, but we are not celebrating those small wins. And the only good that they are seeing is that someday carbon credits and carbon markets will come and they will reap those benefits. So there is a regenerative agriculture certification, which is being pushed on small marginal farmers, that you adopt regenerative agriculture practices, reduce chemical, reduce carbon generating practices, and then someday carbon credits will happen. So do you see that this day we'll be seeing soon?
I
That's the
actually don't
only
know too
submission.
much. It sounds like you have much kind of deeper knowledge of it, like on a local perspective, but from, say, like Friends of the Earth international perspective, they'd be quite critical of the dependence on carbon markets, because they're depending on oftentimes a lot of infrastructure and technology that doesn't exist yet. The idea of like carbon offsetting too, still doesn't ensure that the polluter is reducing their impact. So yes, we should all be doing as much as we can to, and people who are, you know, planting and maintaining forests across all different types of terrain should be seeking, like, receiving the benefit. And we have that kind of like similar forestry programs here in Ireland. So I do believe that those should be supported, but the scale in which things need to change can't be dependent on like smaller carbon capturing like options or opportunities. It's a much bigger like structural change around how we do consumption and production. So I'd love to know more about it myself, actually. But from, say, I think you can look on Friends of the Earth's international website. They have a kind of what's it called? They have a website link about false solutions. What I'll do is I'll send a few links after our session, just with some of the questions, just to get you some more of that information, because I don't have all of that. But the thing around false solutions, I think, is actually quite interesting. Would that be okay?
Absolutely, Sarah. Thank you so much.
No problem. Great. So Sean, let's go to you and tell us what. So yeah, you've already mentioned that a lot of the work that you've been focusing on is actually more on the fossil fuel phase outs. That's right. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, I would guess so. I can talk a little bit about climate finance and people find that's useful, but I think from my point of view, you're gonna hear a lot about climate finance in the next week or so, and I just want to give maybe a slightly different perspective, just to maybe something that's not flying under our radar, but flying under some people's radars, about fossil fuel phase out and how it's important to keep action on fossil fuel phase out front and center at any discussions around COP29. So I will talk a bit on that. So just let me pull up my notes here. I don't have any slides, so I'm just gonna talk. And if anyone has any questions, feel free to raise your hand, and I will happy to answer them. So I guess we just to start from a point of I don't have to tell everyone why fossil fuel phase out is incredibly important, but one point to make is that there's a bit of history. Last year's COP28 decision text was the first one that called on all countries to transition away from fossil fuels. It's a bit ridiculous that it took 30 years to get there, but it was progress, and it's the first time that this was said. However, there was a few problems with that text. It didn't call on rich countries to act first on fossil fuel phase out and to support countries that are less wealthy. There was also loopholes in the text which defined gas as a transition fuel, and they lean quite heavily on carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, which have been proven to capture far less carbon than they claim almost every time. So this is why it's incredibly important to remember this. And in terms of COP29, we go into it in a context where fossil fuels still amount for 75% of global greenhouse gas emissions. Despite this, the COP29 presidency released an action agenda in September, and none of the agenda items mention phasing out coal, oil, or gas. So like simply not a acceptable position to be going to COP in. And what we're trying to fly the flag for is that fossil fuel regulation phase out isn't relegated to the sidelines in negotiations, that it plays a key role in the final decision text, and that more ambitious language, getting rid of the transition fuel element, getting rid of the unabated fossil fuel phase out language, in the final decision text of COP. Now, whether that's going to happen or not is a different question, but this is what we're trying to keep on the agenda of the negotiations. What we're calling for, someone had asked that question earlier, in terms of this, what we're calling for is we really need the Irish delegation and Minister Ryan to push the EU, first of all, to keep fossil fuels on the agenda. For example, the European Parliament published a statement recently on COP29. The European Parliament statement on COP29, I would encourage people to read it if they get a chance. I can put a link in. But it's usually a lot more progressive than the European Council statement, mainly due to how the European Parliament works versus how the European Council works. So there's some really interesting things in that. But the European Council is calling on fossil fuels to be included in talks around the global stocktake, and also Brazil has called for a fossil fuel work stream to be included under the mitigation work program, which is going to be a key work program at COP29. So yeah, we're calling on Mr. Ryan to keep this on the agenda. In terms of concrete actions they can take, this is the last COP before all parties to the Paris Agreement will be required to submit their updated nationally determined contributions. So these are the documents which lay out their key climate targets, and this is what we use to calculate the track we're on, how many degrees of warming are we on track for. For example, the UN came out with a report, I'm sure everyone saw it last week, which was the emissions gap report, which showed that we're on track for 2.6 to 3.1 degrees of warming by the end of the century. So the NDCs are increased ambition in the NDCs, nationally determined contributions, is how we make sure that 2.6 degrees to 3 degrees of warming doesn't happen, and that we keep it below 1.5 degrees. So we're calling on the Irish delegation, Minister Ryan, to push the EU to use COP to declare that fossil fuel phase-out timelines. This is coal by 2030, gas by 2035, oil by 2040. There are some timelines that have been suggested by civil society. I think there's open room for discussion on all of them, but we're pushing on Mr. Ryan to try to get the EU to declare this at COP that they will put fossil fuel phase-out timelines in their updated nationally determined contribution, which they're required to submit by February 2025. I see Sarah sent a useful resource into the chat there. And then also we need all parties to the Paris Agreement, and we'll be arguing for this, to make sure that it's an equitable and just phase out of fossil fuels that focuses on energy access for the least wealthy people, the people in the poor countries, because it can't be a phase at any cost, but it has to be fair and just, and these less wealthy countries have to be supported by finance, as will be mentioned, from us wealthy countries for their transitions. So there's a couple of different avenues of how fossil fuel phase out can be kept on the agenda. One of them is the concept of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty initiative. So this is an initiative that and a number of small island states in the Pacific, I think some Caribbean states, and also um, the first, I guess, major fossil fuel producer to sign this initiative or sign up to this initiative was Colombia. Um, so that's a major milestone. But this is an initiative which it's like it's follows the same idea of, if anyone's ever been familiar with the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, it's saying that we won't take any more fossil fuels out of the ground. And we have been calling, Friends of the Earth have been consistently calling on the government to support the development of this treaty. And realistically, this is the last opportunity for this particular government to endorse the concept of treaty, and COP29 is the only opportunity they have to do this, really. So we've previously raised a point that we're really ideally placed to support the process of this. We'd be the first EU country. We're part of many many environmental cross-border initiatives like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, and the Department of Foreign Affairs has been involved in other non-proliferation treaties related to nuclear weapons and disarmament in the past. So we've been arguing that we're perfectly placed to do this, and we should use COP as an opportunity to sign this treaty initiative, sign up for this treaty initiative. Another key element that we're going to be advocating on at COP29 in relation to fossil fuel is the influence of the fossil fuel lobby. So I heard a statistic the other day that at COP28, the largest delegation after the UAE in the US was the fossil fuel lobby, which is quite a depressing statistic. So the heads of Shell, BP, they're expected to be there. The COP29 president is a former executive of Azerbaijan's national oil company, and Transparency International and the Anti-Corruption Data Collective recently published a report saying that Azerbaijan's fossil fuel interests, their entrenched levels of corruption and autocratic government put the UN-led climate process at risk, and that they allege that Azerbaijan's national oil company, SOCAR, may be using the conference to negotiate oil and gas deals, as their report found happened last year at COP as well. So this is something that really needs to be combated. Last year, the EU itself brought 130 fossil fuel lobbyists. So what we're calling for, now we don't believe Ireland has included any fossil fuel lobbyists in their delegation this year, from what we've been able to find out. But what we're calling on the Irish delegation to do is to push the EU to develop a robust UNFCCC accountability framework. So this will define conflicts of interest, ensure that the integrity of negotiations are upheld, and that the policy decisions that are made at the negotiations prioritize the public interest and the rights of people in countries all over the world over the pursuit of private profits by fossil fuel lobbyists. So that's a key element we're looking at as well. As I said, COP29 is a key deadline period for new nationally determined contributions, the deadline for which is in February. So this is the last chance for countries to indicate, maybe not publish their nationally determined contributions, but it's the last chance for them to indicate to the world the scale and pace of the actions they're going to take. And they're going to set new targets for 2030 and new targets and updated targets for 2030 and a new target for 2035. So what we're calling for, and this has been an initiative of Can Europe, who are a European NGO, a European NGO network. They have been really pushing the European Commission to go to net zero by 2040 instead of 2050, as that reflects the EU's fair share, and a 2035 target of 82% gross emission reductions. So that's that we're supporting that call. I don't know if I might be repeating this, but the piece around human rights and the participation of civil society at COP29 is also a crucial piece. Azerbaijan and Baku is going to be a difficult atmosphere for civil society activists, especially from the global south, especially from countries that are currently suffering oppression in other ways, it's going to be a very tough atmosphere. And I think we're trying to make the point to the Irish delegation and to the EU delegation that civil society, if they express some of these views, maybe there may be consequences, unfortunately. But people in government, people in the EU can express these views, and should have a bit more protection. So we absolutely are calling on them to express in the strongest terms their respect for human rights, and their rejection of militarism and the destructive and polluting emissions that causes. Sarah said a statistic earlier that was it the first 7 months of the genocide in Gaza, that it was the equivalent of the emissions of 26 countries. And this is something that we like. There's no climate justice without human rights and the protection of human life. And while we might find it difficult in Azerbaijan to vocally make these arguments, for safety reasons, we need the Irish delegation in the EU to really bang the drum on that. That is all I had to say. If anyone's interested a bit more in climate finance, I can go into it. But as I said, people will probably hear a lot on climate finance in the next few days/week. So I try to give a bit of a change there. If anyone has any questions, feel free to ask them.
Thanks so much, John. Yeah, are there any questions about sort of what we'll be doing on the ground there? We also will have some time now just to capture some of your thoughts and your demands. I've got a type form here. Let me see if I just got the right one. Yeah. Which we're going to be kind of printing out and bringing in a binder and bringing to COP as well. So it'll be great to get your voice heard directly from you as well. So that's in the chat now if you want to have a look at that. But feel free to unmute yourself and tell us what you're thinking at this stage. Thanks so much, John.
No problem. Like, as I said, there's lots more to say on climate finance. And if anyone is interested, I would really recommend reading the work that development organizations in Ireland. I don't know if anyone is familiar with them, but Trócaire and Christian Aid and Action Aid, they have been advocating quite strongly around climate finance, and their views on that are very ambitious and really keep they're really advocating on behalf of the people who need the public finance. So I think they're doing good work. So if anyone wants to read a bit more, that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, we can share links as well on any of the follow-up stuff at the end of the slides. We can put all those sort of links in that Sean has referenced as well. There's yeah, go on.
Yeah, I just had one more thing to add, actually. I think, yeah, you might be doing this already, Sarah, but just to mention some of the events we have coming up.
Yeah, I've got a slide up actually, so that might be helpful to share.
Yeah,
I'll just
perfect.
1 second. Oh wait, 1 second. Yeah, here we go. I did once upon a time. So there are a few events coming up that you can take part in here in Ireland and in Dublin. So there is the Climate Justice Day of Action, which is happening on the 12th of November. If you go to friendsoftheearth.ie, look at the events section, we've got all of these details. So the Climate Justice Day of Action there's lots of activities that are happening all around Ireland of activists going out on the streets. We've got flyers with our own demands coming up to the general elections and the demands for programme for government. There's another workshop that's focusing on COP specifically, which is in collaboration with Trinity College, their Politics and Environment Society, and NYCI, National Youth Council as well, are supporting on this too. And it looks at it's a panel discussion and youth climate workshop on what is the point of COP, bringing in a panel of lots of diverse voices and opinions, which takes in, you know, like we talked about here. What is the point of COP? How do people get involved? What are the critiques of it too, from all angles? And then there's also the climate march that will be happening on the 16th of November. That is with Climate Justice Coalition. So check out their social media and for meeting points. And there will also be a Stop Climate Chaos photo stunt that's happening this Sunday. So I don't know if there's any invites going out to that specifically, but you'll see, hopefully get to see all the media about that next week whilst myself and Molly are in Baku. So we really want to see that this COP is on the agenda again. But like I say, every bit of information in terms of our actual events, you can go onto the Friends of the Earth website. And there is a second type form that I'm putting into the chat now. And this is for just some feedback on the on our events. So this workshop and webinar is funded by Irish Aid, so it really makes a big difference to us being able to capture some of your evaluation and your feedback, and helps us to design more educational opportunities too. So I'll let you guys click through them. I'll take a few moments to fill in, not that long. First one's probably a little bit longer because you get to share your opinion. The second one is more of like a 2-minute click through, but both are really, really helpful for us. Just want to say thank you so much to Sean, Anya and Molly for taking time this evening to share their expert opinion, and hopefully we'll be able to bring a lot of your thoughts to COP as well. So I'm going to stop recording.